The German invasion of the Soviet Union in 1941 was initially defined by the swift, armored thrusts of blitzkrieg. German generals relied on speed, maneuver, and the coordination of tanks and aircraft to achieve rapid, decisive victories. This emphasis was a core tenet of the Wehrmacht's tactical philosophy, which had swept across Western Europe with devastating effectiveness. However, the war on the Eastern Front would soon evolve into a grinding, brutal contest of attrition on an unimaginable scale. It was a war where the initiative eventually passed from the German tank to the Soviet gun. The Red Army's artillery force, known throughout history as the God of War, became the single most terrifying and decisive factor for the German High Command. This fear was not based on the quality of any single weapon, but on the sheer, overwhelming quantity and the sophisticated, centralized doctrine guiding its use. From the siege of Leningrad to the final Battle of Berlin, the sound of the Soviet artillery barrage became the soundtrack to the Wehrmacht's inevitable defeat. German defensive positions, built with painstaking care and confidence, were systematically reduced to dust and debris by the endless rain of Soviet shells. Generals like Erich von Manstein and Heinz Guderian repeatedly lamented in their reports and memoirs about the paralyzing effect of the Soviet fire. They realized that the scale of the destruction prevented timely troop movement, disrupted communication lines, and utterly shattered the morale of their men. This realization represented a fundamental shift in the nature of warfare, moving away from the German ideal of mobile excellence towards a terrifying reality of industrial, localized annihilation. The ability of the Soviet Union to mass thousands of guns in a single sector meant that local German superiority, which they often sought, was instantly nullified by an avalanche of steel. It was this inescapable, predictable, and geographically vast superiority that transformed German tactical fear into strategic dread. The continuous presence of this overwhelming firepower ensured that German victory on the Eastern Front was simply logistically and physically impossible. The Soviet Union's command economy, though initially reeling from the German onslaught, eventually proved uniquely suited to sustaining a war of immense material expenditure. While German industrial production focused on quality and advanced designs, the Soviet factories relentlessly churned out reliable, simple, and rugged artillery pieces and ammunition in astronomical numbers. The 76.2 mm ZIS-3 divisional gun became the quintessential example of this wartime industrial philosophy, being easy to mass-produce and incredibly versatile in the field. This single type of gun could serve effectively as an anti-tank weapon, a field gun, and direct infantry support, simplifying logistics and maintenance for the entire Red Army. The sheer quantitative disparity between the Soviet and German output became obvious by 1943 and only grew wider until the end of the war. For major Soviet offensives, the industrial machine ensured that the artillery corps could stage hundreds of thousands of shells, enough for continuous firing for days on end. German generals, accustomed to rationing ammunition for their own fire missions, were horrified by the Soviet ability to simply saturate entire sectors with unrestrained fire. They knew that every single German position was now mathematically vulnerable to an obliteration that their own industry could never inflict in return. The relentless pace of Soviet production meant that even heavy German losses in men and material could be replaced, but their own dwindling supplies became a constant source of anxiety. This imbalance was not just a tactical problem, it was a strategic declaration that the Soviet Union could afford to win a long, grinding war of attrition, while Germany could not. The logistics involved in moving and supplying this mass of artillery, a feat requiring massive trains and truck convoys, was a logistical marvel that the German generals found deeply unsettling. The ability to maintain an unrelenting torrent of shellfire over hundreds of miles of front meant that there was no safe area, no respite, and no place for the Wehrmacht to hide. The industrial capacity that fed the guns became the silent, terrifying partner to the artillery crews, signifying a defeat written in the massive production quotas of shells. The Soviet Army's mastery of artillery was rooted in a sophisticated military concept known as the deep battle doctrine. This doctrine sought not merely to breach the enemy's front line, but to simultaneously shatter the defense deep behind the immediate point of contact. In the execution of this strategy, artillery was elevated to its most crucial role as the primary tool for paralyzing the enemy's operational depth. The fear for German generals was the realization that their command posts, their communication centers, their supply dumps, and their precious reserve formations were all priority targets. During a Soviet artillery offensive, the operation would begin with a phase of deep strike interdiction, often utilizing heavy guns with long-range capabilities. These initial strikes were designed to disrupt the German ability to organize counterattacks, prevent the movement of reinforcements, and sever the vital arteries of command and control. German commanders found themselves blinded and paralyzed, often unable to issue effective orders or receive vital intelligence due to communications equipment being destroyed. The lack of reserves and the inability to coordinate a unified response meant that when the Soviet infantry finally advanced, the German defense was already strategically broken. The subsequent phase involved the famous concentrated preparatory fire on the German forward positions, achieving unparalleled densities of guns per kilometer. This preparation was followed by a creeping barrage, a precise, coordinated curtain of fire that advanced slowly, just ahead of the Soviet infantry and tanks. This synchronized maneuver left surviving German defenders no time to recover or reman their positions before the Red Army soldiers were upon them. The German generals understood that the Soviet artillery fire was not random destruction, but a calculated, phased process designed to methodically dismantle their entire defensive structure from front to rear. This terrifying, orchestrated violence meant that any defense was not just difficult but structurally impossible against a foe who could literally level a battlefield before the final assault began. The deep battle doctrine turned artillery into a weapon of operational warfare, not just tactical support, a fact that kept the German high command in a state of perpetual anxiety. The BM-13 Katyusha multiple rocket launcher, while technically a simple weapon, inflicted a psychological toll on German troops that was disproportionate to its size or mechanical sophistication. German soldiers quickly coined the terrifying nickname Stalin's organ for the weapon due to the distinctive, howling sound of its rockets as they ripped through the air. This sound alone was enough to induce panic in the ranks, instantly warning of an impending deluge of highly explosive projectiles that offered no prior warning whistle. Unlike traditional shells, which could be individually tracked, the Katyusha fired a rapid, overwhelming volley of rockets in a matter of seconds. A single battery could deliver the destructive power of several dozen conventional guns into a small, concentrated area almost instantaneously, achieving an unparalleled shock effect. The Katyusha was notoriously inaccurate by the standards of a high-precision gun, but its sheer volume of fire compensated for this lack of precision. This inaccuracy was, in a perverse way, a source of additional fear for the German troops, as it meant there was no safe corner in the target zone. Soldiers could not predict where the next rocket would land, amplifying the sense of chaos, helplessness, and total exposure to random, devastating force. The rocket's high explosive warheads were less effective against dug-in positions, but they were devastating against personnel, vehicles, and the delicate communication networks of the German forces. The weapon's extreme mobility was another factor contributing to the German generals' anxiety, as the launcher could fire its entire payload and vacate the position before counter-battery fire could even be organized. This hit-and-run capability made the Katyusha a phantom, elusive threat that could appear and disappear at will, striking without warning and vanishing into the vastness of the front. The constant possibility of a sudden, shattering Katyusha attack ensured that German troops in assembly areas, supply points, and rear echelons never felt truly secure. The psychological impact of the weapon was so severe that it often caused the immediate disintegration of local command, leading to panic and unauthorized retreats from the sector. The Soviet success with artillery was deeply dependent on its highly centralized command and control structure, a system that differed greatly from the German approach. German artillery was typically distributed and subordinated to individual infantry and panzer divisions, making it responsive to local needs but limiting its massing potential. The Red Army, conversely, organized its guns into massive, specialized formations such as artillery divisions, breakthrough artillery corps, and supreme high command artillery reserves. These massive formations were controlled at the army or front level, allowing for the rapid and overwhelming concentration of thousands of guns onto a single, narrow sector of the front. This centralization meant that a single officer could order a coordinated barrage involving a density of firepower that the German military structure could never hope to achieve. The system was designed for operational, rather than purely tactical, impact, treating the artillery corps as a strategic hammer blow to shatter the German line. German generals were constantly frustrated by the speed at which the Soviets could shift hundreds of artillery pieces to a new, critical breakthrough point in a matter of hours. This organizational flexibility ensured that the Red Army could always achieve a crushing, localized superiority, even when the overall troop numbers were initially balanced. The centralized control also facilitated the meticulous coordination of different calibers of weapons, from small mortars to heavy siege guns, for maximum destructive synergy. Specialized staff officers and advanced plotting techniques allowed the Soviet command to calculate and execute complex, multi-phase fire plans with remarkable precision and synchronization. This contrasted sharply with the often improvised and localized fire planning of German divisional commanders who lacked the massive centralized resources. The German generals knew that they were not just fighting individual guns but a unified, thinking organism of firepower that was centrally directed and logistically fed from Moscow. This centralized, overwhelming coordination gave the Soviet artillery a strategic, inescapable power that paralyzed the German command from the moment they realized their organizational disadvantage. The most direct and immediate source of fear for German commanders was the Red Army's increasing proficiency in counter-battery fire. This was the ability to rapidly locate and destroy German artillery positions, effectively silencing the only means the Wehrmacht had of fighting back against the Soviet barrages. In the early years of the war, German gunners operated with relative impunity, but the Soviets quickly developed sophisticated counter-battery techniques. They employed a combination of advanced sound ranging systems, flash spotting teams, and dedicated aerial reconnaissance flights to pinpoint German gun locations. Once a German battery was located, the Soviet response was swift, devastating, and disproportionate, often involving a massive, concentrated salvo from multiple Soviet batteries. The Germans were particularly vulnerable to the Soviet heavy-caliber weapons, such as the 152 mm howitzers and the massive 203 mm bead for mortar, nicknamed the Stalin sledgehammer. These shells were powerful enough to obliterate German guns, destroy their prepared firing positions, and inflict catastrophic casualties on the gun crews. This constant, existential threat forced German artillery units to adopt restrictive shoot-and-scoot tactics, severely limiting their rate of fire and overall effectiveness. German guns had to fire a few rounds and immediately displace, often before their fire mission was even completed, to avoid the virtually guaranteed Soviet counterstrike. The successful Soviet suppression of German artillery meant that Wehrmacht infantry and tanks were frequently left without fire support during critical moments in the battle. German commanders grew to fear the sudden, violent silence that followed a Soviet counter-battery strike, knowing that their own forces were now exposed and vulnerable. The loss of the artillery duel effectively ceded fire superiority to the Red Army, condemning German frontline troops to endure the Soviet barrages without any hope of reprisal. This continuous loss of their primary support weapon was a major contributor to the psychological breakdown of German frontline units and the strategic anxiety of their generals. Behind the terrifying roar of the Soviet guns lay an equally terrifying logistical system capable of sustaining the massive expenditure of ammunition. The German generals' fear was amplified by the realization that the Soviet barrage was never a one-off event. It was a promise of continuous, overwhelming fire for the foreseeable future. The Soviet Union state control allowed for the ruthless prioritization of artillery ammunition production and transport above almost all other battlefield requirements. Massive amounts of shells were produced in factories across the Urals and Siberia, far out of reach of German air strikes. The transport of this staggering volume of material across the vast distances of the Eastern Front was a logistical triumph. Railroads were hastily repaired, and immense convoys of trucks, many provided through the indispensable American Lend-Lease program, kept the ammunition flowing to the front. This guaranteed supply chain meant that Soviet commanders rarely, if ever, had to curtail fire missions due to a lack of shells. In contrast, the German military was constantly struggling with logistical shortfalls, often having to ration precious artillery rounds for only the most critical defensive moments. The Soviet capacity to stage up to 1 million shells for a single, focused offensive operation, such as those that led to the encirclement of Army Group Center, was staggering to the German staff. This logistical depth ensured that the intensity of Soviet fire would only increase as the Red Army advanced, making the prospects of a sustained German defense utterly hopeless. The German generals understood that they were fighting not just the Red Army, but the entire, fully mobilized industrial might of the Soviet state. The constant arrival of fresh ammunition, often heralded by the sight of endless truck columns, was a visible, tangible sign of a war they could not possibly win on material grounds. This material superiority removed the hope of winning a war of attrition, confirming the artillery's role as the inexhaustible engine of the Red Army's offensive campaigns. The heavy calibers employed by the Soviet Artillery Corps were specifically designed to shatter the most robust German fortifications and break the will of the defenders. German defensive doctrine relied heavily on deeply dug trenches, concrete bunkers, and meticulously constructed strongpoints to withstand enemy fire. However, the Red Army utilized enormous 152 mm and 203 mm shells with such frequency and density that these defenses were rendered completely obsolete. These shells possessed the kinetic energy and explosive power required to punch through thick reinforced concrete, collapsing the fortifications into lethal traps. A well-constructed German pillbox, designed to be a bastion of defense, could be turned into a coffin for its occupants by a few concentrated hits from a BF mortar. The systematic destruction of these defensive structures was profoundly demoralizing for the German troops who relied on them for survival. The physical terror was compounded by the psychological trauma of the prolonged barrages, which could last for many hours or even days before a major offensive. The constant concussion, the earth-shaking vibrations, and the pervasive dust and noise induced a high incidence of combat fatigue and psychological breakdown. Many German survivors emerged from the barrages shell-shocked and barely able to comprehend, let alone resist, the Soviet infantry attack that followed. The German generals realized that their defense-in-depth strategy was failing because the artillery simply created a shallow defense in rubble. The inability of their soldiers to hold a position after enduring such a cataclysmic event was a strategic defeat achieved by explosives alone. The Soviet artillery became the ultimate weapon of demoralization, turning the defenders' sanctuary into a place of guaranteed death and despair. This realization fundamentally changed the nature of defense for the Germans, who now knew that resistance only prolonged their exposure to the inevitable. The sheer destructive power of Soviet artillery was officially showcased and named in what were termed the Voroshilov barrages, referring to the massive, concentrated fire plans. These barrages were meticulously calculated to achieve an effective total saturation, ensuring maximum casualties and the obliteration of all visible defensive works. The most terrifying aspect of these fire plans was the density of guns and the coordination of the impact zone, creating a continuous, rolling wave of explosions. At key offensives, the fire would move forward like a literal roller, preventing German troops from emerging from cover or effectively organizing a response. The initial stages of the Great Soviet offensives, like Operation Bagration, were marked by these multi-hour, apocalyptic fire preparations. German observers reported seeing entire belts of forest and vast sections of earth simply vanish under the incessant pounding of high-explosive shells. The German generals knew that any troops caught in the target zone of a Voroshilov barrage had virtually no chance of survival, regardless of their cover. This focused destruction ensured that the Soviet tank and infantry breakthroughs that followed were against a virtually disarmed and psychologically shattered enemy. The Soviet commitment to such overwhelming force underscored their willingness to sacrifice ammunition to save the lives of their infantry, a cold, hard calculation. This approach was philosophically opposed to the more nuanced German use of artillery, which often sought precision and conservation over raw destructive power. The very name Voroshilov barrage became a byword for inescapable military terror among German frontline soldiers and commanders alike. It represented the Red Army's unshakable confidence in its material and logistical superiority to achieve victory through sheer, overwhelming violence. The sheer mass of the fire removed all tactical uncertainty, making the successful defense of the sector mathematically improbable. The German generals were acutely aware that their own field artillery was technically excellent but fatally limited in its ability to match the Soviet threat. The German 10.5 cm Lee Fh-18 howitzer was a finely crafted, accurate, and reliable piece of equipment, but it was simply too few in number to contest the Soviet legions of guns. German production never prioritized the sheer volume of field artillery to the extent that the Soviets did, focusing resources on tanks and anti-tank weapons instead. This production deficit meant that German units often had to fight with only a fraction of the fire support available to their Red Army counterparts. Furthermore, the German system was not structured to achieve the necessary mass of fire at a critical point due to its decentralized command. They lacked the centralized artillery reserves that allowed the Red Army to suddenly concentrate 1,000 guns on a single sector of the front. German fire missions were typically less destructive, relying on precision and tactical necessity rather than the wholesale landscape-altering obliteration favored by the Soviets. The German generals also faced persistent ammunition shortages, forcing them into a conservative fire doctrine that was strategically ineffective against the Soviet steamroller. This inability to reply in kind to the massive Soviet barrages was a source of constant frustration and a primary contributor to their feeling of helplessness. When a German attack did occur, it was often unsupported or thinly supported by fire, making it susceptible to the immediate, crushing Soviet counterfire. The German artillery was caught in a vicious cycle, too few to make a difference, and too easily suppressed by the concentrated Soviet counter-battery fire. This inadequacy meant that the Germans were always fighting a defensive battle for fire superiority, a battle they consistently and inevitably lost to the Soviet god of war. The Soviet artillery's threat was not just in the guns actively firing but in the perceived inexhaustible depth of the reserves standing ready to replace any losses. German generals knew that they were facing an enemy who could absorb catastrophic losses in equipment and still maintain their offensive momentum. The Red Army viewed artillery as a consumable commodity, willing to sacrifice guns in the defense or during an aggressive advance to maintain the overall fire advantage. This contrasted starkly with the German view, where every gun lost was a severe and often irreplaceable blow to a unit's fighting capacity. The Soviet ability to rapidly re-equip and retrain entire artillery formations meant that the quality and intensity of their barrages never seemed to diminish. As the Red Army advanced towards Germany, the logistics and production lines were constantly moving with them, ensuring that the heavy guns were never far from a fresh supply of shells. This resilience and depth of resource gave the Soviet artillery a psychological weight that went beyond the mere sound of the shells. It fostered a sense of futility among the German generals, who realized that any tactical success against a Soviet artillery formation would be immediately negated by a replacement unit. The unending stream of men and material flowing from the Soviet rear was a visible manifestation of their state's total commitment to military victory. German commanders were forced to fight a war of diminishing returns, where every enemy loss was quickly remedied, while every German loss was permanent. This depth of resources ensured that the Soviet artillery machine would continue to function with brutal efficiency until the very walls of Berlin were reduced to rubble. The strategic realization that the Soviet reserves were functionally limitless was a far greater source of fear than any tactical engagement on the battlefield. The final judgment rendered by the Soviet artillery was the destruction of the German military machine and the strategic loss of the Eastern Front. German generals concluded that the Red Army's mastery of massed, concentrated firepower was the most decisive factor in the ultimate outcome of the war. The relentless barrages eroded the German soldiers' will to fight, demolished their defenses, and severed their critical command and supply links. The Soviet artillery successfully nullified the tactical advantages of the German blitzkrieg, forcing a transition to a war of attrition they could not win. The terrifying sound of the Katyusha and the relentless pounding of the heavy howitzers became the indelible memory of defeat for the German command. Their fear was validated by the ruins of their fortifications and the cemeteries filled with the victims of the Fuhrwalls, the Great Fire Roller. The Soviet artillery was not simply a supporting arm, it was the main engine of the offensive, battering down the door for the infantry and tanks to follow. The German generals were forced to concede that their defeat was not solely due to superior German maneuver but to the overwhelming material superiority of the Soviet gun. The legacy of the Eastern Front is a testament to the power of industrial mobilization and centralized doctrine applied to the most destructive weapon on the battlefield. The Soviet God of War earned its name by systematically dismantling the German war effort piece by piece, shell by shell. This lesson in the power of massed fire forever changed the face of modern warfare and served as the German general's most enduring, terrifying memory of the conflict. The constant, inescapable presence of the Soviet artillery became the final, ultimate arbiter of the war on the Eastern Front.